at Mount Pisgah as one of your virtual pastors. How can a minority reconcile their faith with racism in the Bible? Well, this video that I'm going to do now is a sort of part 2 of another video on this channel entitled Does the Christian God Love Black People? In that video I broke down how race as we understand it wasn't a thing during the time the Bible was written. Race as we define it in the 21st century is a carryover from 17th century racial social constructs which presented the idea of whiteness to Europe as a means of dehumanizing the black race in order to justify the transatlantic slave trade. Biblical race was about defining people in terms of their people group or nations as distinct racial identities like Jews or Egyptians. There are Jews in the Bible of many different ethnic looks. For example, Moses is identified or mistaken for an Egyptian when he fled to the Midianite territory in the book of Genesis without him announcing his nationality or ethnicity. Now, this indicates that either culturally or in terms of his ethnic look, he could be labeled as an Egyptian despite him being a Jew. Clearly, the Jewish nation didn't all look alike if a Jew could pass for an Egyptian or vice versa, an Egyptian being a dark-skinned African race, given the right clothing, jewelry or hairstyle or the way of carrying himself. If Moses could be identified as an Egyptian, it shows that there were different types of looks to Jewish people, which would allow this to become a confusion for someone in a different territory. Much like today, when your ethnicity and your nationality can be two different things. I, for example, am black by ethnicity, but I'm British by nationality. I've also been in Egypt and been mistaken for a local and almost wasn't given access to the cruise ship that we were on because I was wearing local garb and was taken for an Egyptian. How can a minority reconcile their faith with racism in the Bible? I'd be interested for anyone on this channel to send me some biblical teachings that you found that support hatred for minorities, or indeed the very idea of racism. By that I mean a teaching supporting racial superiority of one race over another. I would argue that biblically speaking, the Bible describes one race, the human race, as presented in the biblical book Genesis chapter 1. God is said to have created humanity, making them all the children of God, bearing the divine image. All humans in biblical theology are a reflection of the divine and are one with God and are one with each other. There is, of course, the so-called curse of Ham, which was pronounced by the patriarch Noah, found in Genesis chapter 9, which I dealt with in the other video that I mentioned earlier. But we need to remember that this so-called curse is issued by one human to another and doesn't carry with it any kind of divine directive or any biblically sponsored hate for black people or any other people group for that matter. In fact, when we look at the biblical account, they are far more than passive and apathetic towards the idea of race. They go straight all in anti-racist. We can see this, for example, in the story of the Good Samaritan, a designation which reveals the contemporary audience of the parable that's attributed to Jesus, their contemporary audience's views about Samaritans. The main character of the story being called a Good Samaritan means that the listeners would have connected being a Samaritan with being bad. A Good Samaritan sounded like an oxymoron to them, sort of like saying a good Nazi or something. Now, a characteristic of racism is assigning moral deficiencies to someone's race instead of to their inner morality as an individual. It groups people together as a glutinous mass and says these people are all the same based on their race, almost like they can't help it, right? When someone attaches the black guy stole the purse, one could ask, why is their racial background being connected to this crime? Was it the fact that this person was black that made them steal the purse somehow, like they didn't even have a choice, it was something in their DNA or something? Or was this an act done by someone who is a thief and who has morally gone beyond that human code, which we all accept to be wrong, and therefore should be identified as a thief and not a black person that is a thief? Connecting race with moral deficiency is a key characteristic of racism, and that's what's sort of happening in this story of the Good Samaritan. The listeners would have assumed that the Samaritan in the story is the bad guy. A man was going down to Jericho and he was attacked by robbers. Now, this was a known thing, that the road from Jerusalem to Jericho was often beset by bandits. It was easy for people to set up on someone. So these guys have set up and they've found this guy, robbed him, leaving him half dead. Now, a priest happened to be going by, it says, which is a Jewish priest, right? Happens to be going by, and he passed by on the other side. And Jesus is trying to go beyond the contemporary idea of what it means to be good, i.e. that you can be good just by virtue of your race. The Bible doesn't teach that. The Bible teaches that each individual is responsible for their own morality, which is a powerful thing in terms of us not being made the victim of other people's assumptions of who we are, but we can be judged, as Martin Luther King said, not by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character. The priest is a servant in the temple, cannot risk becoming what's known as ritually unclean by touching a dead body. If he touches a dead body, then he wouldn't be able to perform his duties in the temple. So again, in this idea, race goes beyond, or a love for people goes beyond what it looks like on the surface. The teaching and the idea behind it is just do what's right and treat everyone the same. So that's the lesson from the priest. The second guy is a Levite. Now, he's an expert in the law and is a type of guy we could assume that is very much concerned about being tricked. So the Levite goes past and he thinks, it's a trick. Now, again, spiritually speaking, we can avoid the divine, participate in the divine story, because what if it's a trick? What if I'm being fooled into doing the right thing and things are going to be taken away from me as a result? But again, the lesson here is just do what your heart tells you is right. Do what you feel God is telling you to do is right. Don't go into things knowing that it's a trap, but the posture and attitude of someone who is always looking over their shoulder is not a healthy posture for our spirituality, much like the priest who's worried about the way things will look so he doesn't do the right thing. This Levite has decided that he's not going to stop and help because it could be a trick and he could end up losing out. But we need to continue to participate in the divine. If you don't do what your heart is telling you to do, how your soul and your heart can become hard and you start to lose your humanity. And that's really what's happened with the idea of racism. It's a loss of humanity. And then finally, the Samaritan comes by and he takes pity on the man, right? And Jesus asks the question, which one of these guys was a neighbor to the man who was robbed? And the person who posed the question to begin with says, well, it was the one who showed him kindness, right? So again, in the biblical account, the idea of race is turned on its head by Jesus, and instead of supporting any racist ideas, he comes in with the anti-racist idea of saying, you know what, you can't judge a whole group of people based on where they come from and what they look like. You have to judge people as individuals. You have to be able to evaluate whether or not this person is in the world doing good, or if the person is in the world doing harm, right? So nowhere in the Bible is racism supported or promoted. In fact, the Bible is anti-racist, and there are many stories where Jesus treats people equally, no matter who they are, where they come from, and what they look like. So I hope this has made sense. Please do get us in the comments if you have any questions or comments. God bless. Peace. Hey guys, thanks so much for following along. I hope that I answered the question well enough. As I said, there is no real racism in that sense taught or supported in the Bible or in biblical theology. There are, of course, people who have used the Bible in such a way as to try to support their racist ideas, but these uses of the biblical theology have in many ways been taken out of context in order to support people's agendas of wanting to dehumanize one race in order to be able to enslave them. If you can take away someone's humanity, then it's easier for someone to abuse that people group or those persons, right? The Bible is anti-racist. It, in so many of Jesus' stories, just like the story of the Good Samaritan, there is a real presentation of an understanding that people are not grouped together as a glutinous mass and judged by where they come from and what they look like, but rather that we should be much more able to use our keen insight and realize that anyone can be a bad person. It doesn't matter what race you come from. It's about what you do with your life and how you treat, mainly how you treat other people. One of the questions that come in is, I wonder where the different races come from. And it's a tricky question to answer because the Bible doesn't really sort of always answer the questions that we have, because the Bible is interested in presenting a vision for humanity, why we exist, who we are, what it means to really be a human. If you take the 10 Commandments, for example, they are largely about how to be a human being, how to treat others in the right way, how to maintain a healthy spirituality, how to not do harm, how to do good on the earth, how to bless make sure that you're receiving blessings from God, and also how to bless other people. So the question is, wonder where the different races came from. There are lots of theories, however, and one of them, the one that I subscribe to, is the idea of micro evolution, in the sense that human beings have been on the planet for a good amount of time, where different races, based on their particular environment, have developed different characteristics, different facial features, different hair types, etc., have been adapted, or humans have adapted to their environment in terms of where they live in the world. That's the main idea that many theologians subscribe to, where the different races came from. But again, that question assumes that in the Bible there is the idea of race in the way that we have it today: black, white, Asian, etc. And as I've argued in my last 2 videos, there is no real basis for that sort of an idea in biblical theology. It's a new idea that has come about after the 1700s, where the
Europeans who wanted to endorse or find a way of supporting the transatlantic slave trade, then began to talk about the idea of whiteness, actually, and began to talk about the idea of there being different races, and some races being superior to the other, some races being more savage than others. But this idea is really outside of something that could really be supported by biblical theology or history. When you look at the way that the world has developed and the way that history has developed in relationship to race, there are many ancient civilizations, many ancient African civilizations especially, which disprove the idea that before Europeans encountered Africans, that Africans were savages. You just have to look at ancient civilizations in Egypt and different places around the world, around Africa rather, many different ancient civilizations, which go to show that the way that Black people, the way that Black Africans were looked at before the slave trade was vastly different to the way they were looked at after the slave trade. My point is that when we ask the question, where did the different races come from? It assumes that the Bible is trying to answer that question. And the Bible is not really concerned with answering that question, because it wasn't a question that existed in the minds of the people that were around when it was written, if that makes sense. Our understanding of different races comes from the history of slavery, etc., etc. So someone asked the question, racism has a lot of roots in Darwinism, is the question. I am not an expert on Darwinism, so I'm not really able to go in depth into this particular question. But I would assume that when someone speaks about racism in relation to Darwinism, perhaps there is an implication that there are some humans who would look more like monkeys, perhaps, and that the idea of racism is easily supported by Darwinism. But again, any ideas that are any arguments that were made in terms of Darwinism supporting racism would also fall into line with my point of racism being something that exists after the 17th century. You haven't got the idea of Darwinism in the Bible, and therefore when we look at what the roots of racism are, it predates Darwinism. So I would say that Darwinism would have been something that, if it supported racism, would have been the child of racism and not the other way around. Because when you get Darwin writing The Origin of the Species, this is also in the context of a world that has racially charged ideas about who is superior and who is savage and who has a civilization that predates another. It's the idea in colonization is based on the idea that the West took civilization to Africa, and that's just not true. The idea that people were just in Africa living in trees or swinging from trees like monkeys is not supported by any historical evidence. And you can see it in the way that people talk now, even with the coronavirus pandemic. You have a lot of people talking about, okay, why is Africa doing so well in terms of getting control over the pandemic? Because aren't they less developed? It presents a sort of idea that there are two worlds. There's the developed world and the undeveloped world. But really, when we look at it in a more in-depth way, there are countries who have different parts of them that are really developed and other parts that are underdeveloped. There is poverty in Europe in the same way that there's poverty in Africa. And this idea that there are two worlds and that there is the savage, dark Africa, and then there is the civilized, enlightened Europe, is an idea that I believe people are beginning to be able to see through, because many people have traveled to Africa and seen how developed it is, and seen that there are some parts where there are, there's lots of technological advancements, etc. And it's the same as being in any city in Europe. And there are also people who've been to Europe and seen that there are some places that are so deprived and dilapidated that these places could also be looked at as third world countries, so to speak. So why the disparity? It's because a lot of the information that we have about what the world really looks like is outdated information. There are very few countries now these days in the world that are that could be determined third world. There are very few countries where there's no running water, where children don't go to school, where there is a lack of infrastructure that allows people to live a so-called civilized life. So I think that we need to really start to update our understanding of what the world looks like and what the actual state of the world is. Most people in the world, the majority of people in the world, live in countries where they have a decent standard of living. They can go on holiday. They look after their families. Their children go to school. They have all your mod cons in their homes, etc., etc. That's where the majority of people live. There are a few countries that are mega rich, and there are a few countries that are super poor, but most countries live in the middle of that, in the middle of that sort of, in the middle of those two categories, right? So what that means for racism is that it makes it difficult for people to sustain an idea that the reason why these other countries, Africa and different places where people would direct their racism towards, that those countries are not actually suffering in the sorts of ways that people think they are. And this is borne out by a lot of research. Today, you can look at the reports from United Nations, etc., etc. These are statistics and facts that you can check out for yourself. I hope that makes sense. Does that make sense? Are there any more questions? Feel free to jump to reach out to Mount Pisgah if you need someone to pray with you, someone to talk with you about your faith, about your life. There are people who are on hand to do that. Or if you want to go deeper and find out a little bit more about how faith, how participating in the divine can make a positive influence on your mental health and your well-being. Are there any more questions? Because if not, I think we're gonna close it. We're gonna shut it down. It's been great just sharing with you guys. I hope it makes sense. If not, then if there's something I said in the comments or in this question and answer that doesn't make sense, or that you would like to engage more with, then feel free to drop those thoughts in the comments. Make sure you subscribe to Mount Pisgah's YouTube page if that's something that you feel that you're going to get benefit from. And we will see you next time for Candid Conversations. I'm Bobby Bovell, one of your virtual pastors. I think we're going to log off now. Peace. God bless.
Thank you for joining us this evening for Candid Conversation. If you love what you saw here tonight, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, as well as turn on your bell notifications so that way you know every time we go live. Have any questions? Be sure to click the link in our description box and let us know your thoughts. And remember, ain't no judgment on this side. Also, be sure to like, comment, and share us on all of your social media platforms so that way your friends and family can be a part of the community as well and stay in the know of everything here at Mount Pisgah. See you next time.